Hello, listeners. My name is Raj Singhal, and welcome to another episode of Breaking Investment Stereotypes. This episode is brought to you by Multiply.co, where we believe that investing is an ignored life skill. Our mission is to create a platform where people can come learn, share, and collaborate through the right tools. Ultimately, we want your hard earned money to work for you. Here at Breaking Investment Stereotypes, my job is to deconstruct world class investors or wealth managers and deep dive into their investing journey professionally, personally, or both. I want to give a little guidance on how to use the shows. None of the following should be taken as investment advice. Please see multiply.co/disclosures for more information. My guest for today is one of India's most celebrated public market investors and educators, given his penchant for to share his learning frequently. Saurabh Mukherjee is the founder and chief investment officer of Marcellus Investment Managers. Saurabh was educated at the London School of Economics, where he earned a BSc in economics with first class honors and an MSc in economics. In London, Saurabh was the co-founder of Clear Capital, and in 2007, he was rated by the Extel survey as one of the top small cap analysts in the UK. In India, Saurabh was rated as the leading equity strategist in 2015, 16, and 17 by the Asia Money polls. Prior to setting up Marcellus, Saurabh was the CEO of Ambit Capital. Saurabh is a CFA charter holder and a SEBI registered investment advisor. In 2017, upon SEBI's invitation, he joined SEBI's Mutual Fund Advisory Committee. In 2019, Saurabh was part of the expert committee constituted by SEBI to update and upgrade the PMS regulations. Saurabh has written 4 best-selling books: Cruise of Chaos in 2014, The Unusual Billionaires in 2016, Coffee Can Investing, The Low Risk Route to Stupendous Wealth in 2018, and Victory Project, The 6 Steps to Peak Potential. Saurabh is also a fellow of Royal Society of Arts. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Saurabh. Hi Saurabh, I've been reading your books and listening to some of your talks. And while I broadly understand your investment process, can you briefly share for our listeners, how would you describe your investment process?
I mean, look, Raj, it's very simple, right? What we have written in both Unusual Billionaires in 2016 and in Coffee Can Investing in 2018, and what we'll once again reiterate in our forthcoming book is, in India, you just have to do 3 things, which you have to get right if you want to make money in this vast country. One is that the first vast majority of Indian promoters are corrupt, right? The businesses, the books are cooked. And even amongst the cleaner businesses, which I would say around 20% of businesses are clean, quality of management and governance is fairly pedestrian. So the first priority for any investor in India should be to look for a clean set of accounts, believable numbers. I would submit to you that there's no more than 70 such businesses in our country where the published financial statements are a reliable indicator to the quality of the franchise. The second layer of what I think an investor in India has to do is recognize that this is a vast country, but it's still a very poor country. Contrary to any delusions to the delusional view of superpower India and all of that, it is a very poor country, consistently among the world's poorest countries in the United Nations' Human Development Index. And if anybody has any illusions about India being a poor country, hopefully in the last 90 days, the tragic events have put that to rest. So the second thing we therefore do is focus on businesses which sell the essentials of life. These could be services businesses, say Dr. Lal's. These could be product businesses, say Nestle. These could be B2B, the examples I just cited. Sorry, B2C, the examples I just cited, or they could be B2B. Dr. Divi's lab provides the essentials of life, but in a B2B context, it makes 75% of the world's painkiller API. Right? So step one, cleanliness. Step two, essentiality. And the third thing to do in India is invest in monopoly franchises. We are the world's most monopolized amongst the top 10 economies in the world. Pretty much every product or service which is essential in India, either one company or at most two companies take home 90% of the profits from that product. And therefore, the priority in India has to be look for companies which operate unchallenged for all practical purposes. These promoters are not going to come on TV and tell the world, look at me, I'm the monopolist. It's stupid of them to do that. But you and I have to therefore do the work and say, not only is the promoter clean, not only is the product essential, But this company operates by and large unchallenged in its market. So simple examples, as every school child in India knows, uh, practical terms mein only one brand of adhesive sells in the country, right? You and I were in school when Fevicol was a dominant franchise. Now that my kids are in school, Fevicol is still a dominant franchise. As the parent of every young baby in India knows, practical terms, one brand of milk, baby milk powder sells in the country, Nestle with 97% share, right? And similarly, if you want to take a different context, B2B, Divi's Lab is a monopolist in the global painkiller market. 75% of the world's naproxen API is manufactured by Divi's Lab from its Vizag and Hyderabad plants, right? So clean promoter, essential products, and monopoly franchises. That's all we do. We've been doing this for 4 years. We do this for the best part of more than $1 billion now. There's hardly any churn in the portfolio. The good news is this makes us and our clients a lot of money. The bad news is, unfortunately, no more than 30 Indian businesses make the cut here, of which 14, 15 make it to our portfolio. I wish the investable universe was a little bigger, but it is what it is. If there were lots of such companies, I guess there'd be other fund managers who could make money like us. So at one level, it's a blessing in disguise.
So before I come to your, various PMS scheme, and I find them very interesting. You mentioned about 15, 30 companies in your whatever 20 years of career. Has those companies been the same or have they changed? Because also look for like
Yeah, so there's
long-term
around
compounders, right?
this set of elite monopolists, right? Let's call them elite monopolists. By the way, this set of elite monopolists, 20, 25 giant monopolists, they account for 90% of corporate India's profitability, right? So the world's sixth largest economy, 20 firms take home 90% of corporate profits. When my colleagues and I migrated to India 13 years ago, the top 20 profit generators only took home a third of India's profits. So imagine how transformative the last 12, 13 years have been. From one third of corporate India's profits, the elite monopolists now account for 90%. And by the way, it's similar. The statistics for Japan, for Korea are very similar. And America's statistics at a corresponding stage of development were very similar. Every single country which is developed goes through this, what I call profit concentration, profit polarization in the hands of 15, 20 elite franchises. Everybody else is kind of a bystander in this stage of development. Not until you cross $10,000 for $15,000 per capita income do you see profit concentration reduce, right? And anybody in India who believes that profit concentration will reduce in the next 10 years, I think has to be drinking something very interesting, because there is no country in the history of this planet which in the journey to $10,000 per capita income has seen anything other than radical profit concentration. And India's story is very similar to other large economies which have industrialized. Now, how much churn is there in this? There is churn. So if you take the elite 20, 30 franchises, over the course of a 10-year cycle, around half will drop out and another half will jump in. So for example, when I came to India, Kotak Bank wasn't on this list, right? And Kotak Bank now is on this list of elite monopolists. When I came to India, HDFC Bank wasn't in the top 10 now it's number 2 on the PAT generation list in our country, right? When I came to India 13 years back, companies like BHEL, Steel Authority of India were on this list. They have now dropped out for, I'm sure what hopefully for most listeners is obvious as to why they have dropped out. So there is churn here. And therefore, the job of a fund manager is to understand whether these franchises, these monopolies that we are investing in are sustainable monopolies, or is there time in the sun, behind them? And that's what makes the job interesting, right? These are clean franchises, essential products, monopoly franchises. The interesting part is to understand what drives the monopoly and how long can the monopoly sustain. In most cases, the companies we are investing in, we have good visibility that at least the next 10 years, their monopoly power will be more or less unchallenged.
So that's interesting. Actually, you bring an interesting point on per capita income, and I also, we keep telling people that India has an income problem. Actually, India is not a. I mean, my friend made an interesting point that in US the income came first, and then the whole tech ecosystem came later. In China, the income and the tech ecosystem came together. In India, the whole tech ecosystem is already there, but income is missing, right? So and we are still a very poor nation, as you mentioned. So I think we have a long way to go, and I think that's a good point. You
I'm not so sure that's a problem. I think that's a quite positive thing, right? So if you look at America, right? America, 1879, 1880, America was, in every sense of the word, a poor and backward country, right? 1880s, the railroad came to America. 1890s, the telegraph came to America because telegraph got invented in the 1890s. 1910, the Model T Ford came, and the American road network started getting built out 1910 onwards. And by 1930, the modern American economy, the contours of the modern American economy were there. Now, in that 50-year period, 1880 to 1930, pretty much all the American brands that we know of today, right? Kellogg's, Pillsbury, Heinz, Wrigley's, they were all built in that 50-year period. 1880, America did not have a single supermarket. By 1930, America had 500,000 supermarkets. So in America, technology and industrialization came together. The formalization of the US economy have happened together. And India is going through exactly the same process through a very similar dynamic, right? GST, low-cost airlines, highway network, broadband connectivity. And there is nothing unusual about this. What we are going through is textbook formalization. It's happened in Taiwan, it's happened in Japan, it's happened in Korea, it's happened in America. There's nothing unfortunate or fortunate. This is textbook economic development where 15, 20, 25 powerful monopolists drive the development of the country. They obviously do it for their selfish good, but that's how development happens. Development doesn't happen out of charity. Development happens when 15, 20, 25 determined, driven industrialists, monopolists say that, look, I want to build something big, something which dominates the country, changes the country, and their ambition, their drive, their brains drives industrialization, right? There's a lot of people in our country, because of a socialist mindset, have a very romantic notion of how development takes place, courtesy, government, civil servants, politicians. It doesn't work like that. It didn't in Taiwan, it didn't in Japan, it didn't in Korea, it didn't in America. It won't happen like that in India.
No, that's absolutely right. You spoke about the monopolist, and then you said that probably some of this monopoly will last about 10 years. What are the signs one has to see, and over what
Yeah, so
period
the
of time
best
they
way to
drop off?
identify a monopolist, right? So a lot of people mistakenly use market share as a sign of monopoly. Market share has nothing to do with monopoly. So in our country, the leading airline has 55% market share. Does it have a monopoly? No, it doesn't. If tomorrow Vistara or SpiceJet offered lower fares, I would happily switch, right? So the best way to understand the monopoly is, monopolist is that company where even if a rival comes and offers the product 20% cheaper, the customer will say, I am not shifting, boss. Best example, Lactogen, Nestle ka Lactogen milk powder. If tomorrow, assume that Abbott, which is Abbott's product is called Similac, high quality product, very credible product. If tomorrow Abbott cut their prices of Similac by 20%, do you think Indian parents en masse will shift from Nan and Lactogen to Similac? Have you ever heard a parent go to a chemist and say, "Sabse sasta doodh mere bachchi ke liye de do"? Right? I haven't heard that. Right? Nobody buys baby milk basis price. So price has no dimension of the baby milk powder market is responsive to price. Similarly, the world's largest pharma companies buy their naproxen API from Divi's lab. If tomorrow Divi's increase the price of naproxen by 20%, do you think a single customer, any of those MNCs will walk away? They could not care less. Their point is, Divi's supplies the world's purest naproxen API at the lowest cost. Even if the cost goes up 20%, the API is barely 1% of the cost of the drug on the shelves of CVS in America. Right? 1 goes to 1.2, the American pharma company is not going to miss a beat. More importantly, if they were to change Divi's API in their drug, in their formulation, they would have to go back to the FDA, stand in a 2-year queue to get the formulation reapproved. It's simply not worth their while. So the monopolist is that company where a rival comes in, offers a product 20% cheaper, and there is not a single basis point of market share lost.
But
Any company which is competing on price is not a monopolist by definition.
you're right. So actually, interesting point in both of this. So in both the situation in the Lactogen and even in the Divi's lab, the barrier is so high because in case of baby milk, I mean, it's a very emotional thing and nobody wants to take any chance. And in the case of Divi's Lab, you mentioned about FDA, right? Who wants to
No,
wait?
so it's not about emotion. It feels like that,
Okay.
no? There's a
Okay.
deeper
Yeah.
story. I'll tell you some
Uh-huh.
other time that deeper story,
Okay. Yeah.
right? But let's take another example.
Mm-hmm.
Bajaj Finance
Mm-hmm.
has 80% of the market for consumer durable financing in the country.
Mm.
Bajaj Finance is not cheap. Bajaj Finance is
Yep.
the highest ROE NBFC in the country. Why does Bajaj Finance have 80% of the market for consumer durable financing? Why can't Chola, HDFC Bank, HDFC, the might of these massive institutions, why can't they make a dent on Bajaj Finance's consumer durables franchise? Because of barriers to entry. Very
Mm.
cleverly constructed barriers to entry around data science, around artificial intelligence, around the application of that to the customers who come to Chroma or Vijay Sales to buy their electronics. Similarly, the Nestle barrier to entry has nothing to do with emotion. It has
Okay.
everything to do with very clever structuring of the legality around that product. Similarly, Divi's Labs API naproxen barrier to entry only notionally is around trust. There is trust
Mm.
there, but the barriers
Mm-hmm.
to entry are deeper, and that is the skill in investing. To spend 1 to 2 years figuring out what is the real barrier to entry. And it
Mm.
takes that sort of effort, because if you go to meet Murli Diviji or Suresh Narayananji at Nestle or uh, 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 Rajiv Jain at Bajaj Finance, he's not going to say, "Bacha, sit down, let me tell you about my
Mm.
barrier to entry."
Of
He's not
course.
going to do that, right? So you
Mm.
got to do the 1 to 2 years of hard work to figure out why is it practically impossible to compete with Bajaj Finance in several segments. Not all, some of their segments, for example, I think in housing finance, you can compete with Bajaj Finance, I reckon. Similarly, with Nestle in Maggie, I think you can compete. I think Ching's Noodles has done a good job in competing with Maggie. But in baby milk powder with Nestle, in consumer durables financing with Bajaj Finance, in naproxen with Divi's Lab, you cannot compete. And it takes 1 to 2 years to figure it out. And that's where you need to do talk to ex-employees, competitors, industry consultants, regulators to get your head around the barrier to entry. And it's very cleverly done. It's camouflaged. And I think the biggest privilege of living in this country is the camouflage is one that the market can't penetrate. And that's how you load up, you sit back, and you watch the compounding play out over 10, 20 years.
So their moat also includes how to camouflage the whole thing,
Absolutely, it's
right?
quite important. It's
Yeah.
camouflaged in the sense that the average Joe can't figure it
Mm-hmm.
out. So you
Mm-hmm.
got the Nestle one. People
Yeah.
think it's something to do with emotions, right? It's not much to do with emotions. You simply cannot compete with Nestle. So tomorrow, if you and I teamed up
Mm-hmm.
and we say we got some private equity money, we would find it impossible to even get a license to sell the product, baby milk powder, that is. Even if we
Okay.
could get the license, we would not be allowed to advertise. Even if we could advertise, no pharmacist would stock your and my product. Right? Emotions doesn't come into it. We will not get into the business. No license, no advertising. The channel will block you out. Game over.
So the whole thing is okay, cleverly, done. So let's come to your PMS scheme. Interestingly, you have three offerings, and one is called Consistent Compounders. Then you have a small cap called Little Champ, and I think you've recently launched another on financials called King of Capital. How does your selection and investment approach differ, if at all, in each of this?
It's similar. It's identical, actually. Clean promoters, right? Step one, forensic accounting. We've got over the last decade, we've hired in 12 of India's best forensic auditors. And we know most of India's chore promoters on first name terms. They also know that we know that they are chores. Right? It's a
Mhm.
long relationship of knowing these people and understanding how they have cooked their books over many, many years. So first layer across all our portfolios, screen out the naughty people. Second layer is to look for the essentiality piece. So whether it is say fine organics and little champs, fine organics makes the emulsifiers which go into almost all of India's biscuits and baked products, right? Monopolist in emulsifiers. So look for essential products. Fine organics is a B2B monopoly, or as we were discussing in consistent compounders, baby milk powder, consumer durable financing. So look for essentiality. And the third leg across all portfolios, look for barriers to entry. Try to figure out, right? And until you've figured this out, don't invest. Try to figure out why can't anybody compete with Fine Organics? Why can't Rajkumar and Saurabh go to Parle and say, sir, I will I'll sell you cheaper emulsifier than Nestle. Please try us out. Why won't Rajkumar and Saurabh be entertained at Britannia or Nestle if we went with a cheaper emulsifier, right? Why won't Rajkumar and Saurabh be entertained at Divi's Lab if we went with a cheaper glass-lined reactor than GMM Pfaudler, right? Why won't Rajkumar and Saurabh be entertained by Glaxo or by Sanofi or by Pfizer if we went with cheaper active pharmaceutical ingredients than Divi's Lab, right? So the third bit is the time consuming bit. Whilst we have three portfolios, there are some common stocks across each of them. So overall, there's around 30 stocks we've invested in. Little champs are the little monopolists. By definition, little champs are the mini versions of Nestle. Little champs are the mini versions of Pidilite, the mini versions of Divi's Lab. Average market cap of the little champs is $500 million, which is why the compounding is stupendous there. Unfortunately, because there is very little float available in the market, last year in July, we stopped taking inflows into that. So little champs, whoever got in or was lucky to get in by last July, they're obviously making a lot of money, and it'll be difficult for us to take new monies in little champs for a while now, for some period of time. Consistent compounders is the flagship product. Nestle, Asian Paints, Pidilite, HDFC Bank, Kotak Bank, Divi's Lab, etc. Large monopolists, average market cap $25 billion, massively powerful businesses, typical ROC of 45%, free cash flow therefore of 45 minus 15%, 30% would be free cash flow. 1/3 of it dividended out, 2/3 reinvested, 2/3 of 30% is 20%. 20% capital employed reinvested by these dominant monopolists every year, and therefore PAT compounding of 20%. Therefore, my clients is compounding of 20-25% every year. So that's the flagship product that has around 5,000 crores in it now. And then in between little champs, which is niche monopolists, and consistent compounders, which are giant monopolists, in between these two extremities lies kings of capital, which are the financials monopolies in our country, right? So financials is a very intriguing sector, Rajkumar. In the rest of the world, right, including the city you live in, right, the rest of the economy is competitive. Say, if you look at countries like UK, France, Germany, you'll see lots of companies selling biscuits and baby milk and cooking oil and hair oil and paint and adhesives, right? But financial services will be monopolized. So the UK will have 3-4 large banks, 3-4 large life insurers, 2-3 large general insurers, 5-6 large brokerages, and that'll be it. And similarly for France and Germany. India is reverse. Our normal economy is monopolized, as discussed over the last 20 minutes. Our financial services is bizarrely fragmented. Right? We have 50 banks, we have 10,000 NBFCs, we have as many wealth managers, I think, as there are offices in BKC, right? We have 25 life insurers and so on. Now, the reason we have a bizarrely fragmented financial services industry in India is threefold. One is public sector intervention. So the government of India for 70 years has taken tax dollars and given it to public sector enterprises who have no commercial viability, but who run at the behest of the government of India using our hard-earned income tax payments, right? Second is corruption, right? If there is corruption in corporate India, in lending, the corruption is magnified further, right? By collusion of client auditors, credit rating agencies who look the other way and give very generous ratings. And I also have to confess, collusion of parts of my industry, the fund management industry, where fund managers work with promoters to invest in substandard lenders, right? The third aspect of why we have fragmented financial services is our financial services sector itself is very, very small, right? India's household savings is around 10 trillion. And as the RBI has repeatedly pointed out in the last 5 years, financial savings as a percentage of household wealth is only 5%. So out of our $10 trillion household balance sheet, $9.5 trillion is in physical assets. Barely $500 billion is financial assets. This skew has no precedent anywhere in the world. The RBI has said so. The Credit Suisse World Wealth Report has said so.
And that 5% you're including bank deposits as well, I'm assuming.
Yeah, all financial assets are Milake, right?
Okay.
So Put it another way, Jeff Bezos has more financial assets than the whole of India put together.
That's
Separately.
interesting. Yeah.
Now, what's happening is all three of these factors are under pressure. Firstly, because of COVID, the government doesn't have the money anymore to sustain 50 loss-making PSU banks, right? Loss-making in the sense ROE is below cost of equity. Even for State Bank of India, return on equity has been below cost of equity for the best part of a generation. So as these PSU banks slide into oblivion over the next 10, 20 years, the 60% market share that they have will migrate to the private sector banks. And in Kings of Capital, we're making money from that by investing in 5 clean, well-run, dominant private sector banks. The second aspect as the naughtiness in the NBFC sector, corrupt accounts, client credit rating agencies and naughty fund managers, as that is cracked down upon by the authorities, right? The funding supply to naughty NBFCs, to bad NBFCs, has been cut off. There are by and large 100 prominent NBFCs in the country. I'll be surprised if even 10 of these guys are around a decade hence. Right? My reckoning is the NBFC sector will polarize very sharply. So lenders such as Bajaj Finance, which is part of our Kings of Capital portfolio, Bajaj Finance's market share today is 1.5%. Right? If a decade hence it's not 5-6 times this number, I'll be astonished, because as the weaker NBFCs, the more corrupt NBFCs die, BAF gains share. And the third aspect, the financialization aspect, financialization of savings, right? Your and my relatives, friends in the country have realized that there is no great fun in buying flats and gold anymore. Your wealth actually depletes in real terms the more flats and the more gold you buy, right? And what we are seeing over the last 5 years is every time there's an exigency like demon or COVID, the flows into financial products, life insurance, health insurance, motor insurance, asset management, pensions is increasing, right? It's roughly increasing at the rate of 1% a year. So 5% of 10 trillion becomes 6% of 10 trillion in a year, 7%. So each year there's around $100 billion of domestic inflows into this financial savings pot. So the $500 billion pot, a decade hence, even without compounding, should be around 1.5 trillion. With a little bit of compounding, it becomes 2 trillion. So the savings pot quadruples, I reckon, in the next 10 trillion. By the way, it still means that a decade hence, even a decade hence, 85% of Indian wealth will still be flats and gold. But just the 10% shift, I reckon, will transform the insurance industry, the asset management industry, the wealth management industry. And that's what we are participating in India and Marcellus.
So I agree with you on the real estate part, and we'll come to the real estate question sometime later. But gold is kind of is the only dollar hedged asset for an Indian investor, and actually it's helped them in this whole.
I don't quite get this dollar hedge point, right? It's not as if the rupee is some banana republic currency. From 91 to today, we can see the rupee's depreciation is a steady 3.5%. And the reason for that is the inflation differential between India and America. So what exactly is this big priority on hedging the rupee? I've never quite got my head around it. I would love it if you or somebody else could explain to me what is this great fascination with hedging the rupee.
So we'll come to this in some other conversation. I'll put
a lot of HNWs have raised this. I have to hedge the rupee. Why, boss? I mean, are you investing in Zimbabwe or are you investing in India?
No, I understand. But as I said, right, well, let's discuss this in some other conversation.
It's not as if American 10-year bond yield in dollar terms is anything other than the risk-adjusted equivalent in India. So the Indian 10-year bond yield, GSEC, is giving you 6.5. The American one is 2.5. The currency risk premium is the 4.
Absolutely.
So I failed to understand. I've heard this jazz for a long time.
You're absolutely right.
I haven't figured out why.
Long period, the depreciation is not more than 3.5%.
Exactly.
And right? with a focus on India as inflation
and this is
it should come down.
This is a central bank which has $550 billion of FX reserves. So again, I think and a lot of this discussion, right, and one of the reasons it's so much fun living in India and working here is a lot of our mindsets are legacy mindsets. Why do wealthy Indians buy flats and gold? Because they and their parents grew up in an era where they couldn't trust the financial system, where buying flats and gold was seen as a way to grow wealth, not to just preserve. That era is gone, but the mindset hasn't. So even now, half my neighbors will say, ye flat dekha hai, wo building ke bare mein suna hai. And I kind of think these are intelligent business people. Why do they want to invest in flats in Bombay or Delhi or wherever? And similarly, even for people who have left India, the mindset is still कि बस गरीब देश को छोड़ के आए, भिखारी देश को छोड़ के अभी भी भिखारी होगा. Nobody told them that the central bank has the best part of $600 billion of FX reserves.
So since you brought in real estate, let me come to that now. So I think in 2016, you probably called out that, real estate trap, and you've been talking about that. Are you still holding the same view? I mean, in terms of that.
I mean, you tell me, Rajkumar, you've worked in banking. If you have a country where the cost of a home loan is, and this is a record low, by the way, cost of home loans in India
is a record low,
6.5%, 6.6%, right? Record low, all-time low. Yeah. The rental yield on flats everywhere in the country is after tax 2%.
It is.
So, unless there's some rampant capital appreciation, which is going to happen in a country where affordability on flats is already stretched, I'm a little perplexed as to what is the business case. I understand the business case for buying an affordable flat in the deep suburbs of Bombay, Delhi, Bangalore, because these are cities with large commuter working class people who need a residence of their own, and it's a very visceral need, right? And a roof, the desire to own your own home is a very visceral need. But that's the first time buyer buying a 50 lakh, 1 crore, 1.5 crore flat in the deep suburbs of Bombay, say Borivali, Kandivali, Sarjapur in Bangalore, Noida, Gurgaon. But the business case for buying luxury property in South Bombay, South Delhi, Indiranagar, Bangalore somehow beats me, right? I can't see the business case. I can see the emotional case for buying your first home, affordable chota sa flat. But the business
case, that's not even an investment decision, actually. First home is not even an investment decision.
So the investment decision piece beats me. My reckoning is that, I mean, the residential piece, anybody who wants to do it is welcome to do it. It's their money, theirs to burn. The commercial real estate market, my reckoning is gradually will be owned by the global PE funds and the global pension funds.
And we are seeing that.
And once they do that, they will own it at their cost of capital, which is say 6% dollar. Now, if an Indian investor says, I want 6%, I want to own a flat, I want to own an office in BKC with a rental yield of 7-8% in rupee terms, they're welcome to do that. But then you might as well buy a tax-free IRCTC bond, no? So it's sort of much ado about nothing in many regards, I reckon. And these are the sorts of discussions I love having over a drink on a Saturday evening, but never quite understood how money is made out of these.
And then we'll have those discussions one of these days when we meet. Let's come to the next part. I mean, we have now access to all sort of data, with online sources, including Twitter, and not to forget the WhatsApp University. Information no longer seems to be the edge. And there is a problem of plenty. How do you consume your information? What's your
look? I don't have any access to social media.
I know that now. Mobile phone, I got to realize that.
Right? You're trying to reach me on my mobile phone. My mobile phone also doesn't function. The reason I've never sort of lost too much sleep about it is last I knew, Divi's Labs monopoly secrets are not on social media. Fine Organics is monopoly. The reason it's a monopoly is not on social media. So on and so forth, right? The core of what makes money, the core of what makes money in India or elsewhere does not circulate on social media, nor is it sort of, displayed on in the annual report on page 65 in bold text, right? And that's why we've never lost too much sleep about it. Neither are we that fussed about chatter. What is the latest view on what is the Fed going to do and what is the RBI going to do? What will India's next GDP print be? What is the IMF's view on the COVID crisis in India? What is the Chinese government or American government's view on the COVID? We've never really understood how people correlate these things to investing. This is good sort of lunchtime gossip to be had, if you and I met at a coffee shop in Hong Kong, but it doesn't make any money. So I think a lot of people confuse chatter, social media, infotainment and entertainment with investing. It has got nothing to do with investing. It is about as relevant to investing as figuring out whether India or New Zealand will win the World Test Championship. Interesting, but not really relevant for my day job. And hence, I've never really lost too much sleep about not having access to social media or being any part of that discourse. It's a very interesting discourse, but
and you don't miss that at all. I mean, you've not been there, so
look, I think I've got enough to read and enough to do, so it's all right. Yeah,
Okay,
I mean, life goes
I
by.
know. True. Uh, Given the fact that markets are considering markets is it's supposed to be a discounting machine, right? I mean, and you spoke about many of those big companies like Nestle and Asian Paints, but they continue to outperform Nifty over a sustained period, even when they are trading at such a high valuations. What is your thought on valuations, and some of these are trading at 70, 80
I
p? How
actually
does
have
one look at
even
that?
thought on this. I don't even look at the PE multiples. So a lot of people
Okay.
tell me a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
are far better informed than me on these subjects. So they
Mm-hmm.
say this stock is at 60, somebody else says 80, somebody else says 100. And I find it very interesting. The same company at the same point in time, three different people will give me three different PE multiples. I wonder, ask myself, it's like a Hindu philosophy question. What is the PE multiple of Nestle's at this point in time? Also, a lot of people don't seem to agree upon. But the reason we don't worry about these things is as follows: the job of a fund manager is not to sort of say that Nestle's P multiple today is X and it should have been Y, right? And X versus Y is a delta of so and so, and let me make an investment call on it. That is not the job of a fund manager. The job of a fund manager is to say, how long can Nestle's monopoly sustain? That is the single one line mandate of a fund manager. How long can Nestle or Divi's Lab or Bajaj Finance or Pidilite or Asian Paints' monopoly sustain? And this question, and this answer is of immense significance, because if a franchise can grow cash flows at 25% for the next 5 years, but no more than that, I'll happily pay 25 times earnings. If the same franchise can grow free cash flow at 25% for 15 years, I can still make money paying 80 PE for it. And if the same franchise can grow free cash flows at 25% over the next 25 years, even if I pay 250 PE for it, I'm still going to make return on equity, return on my money above my cost of my capital, right? Now, is Nestle's franchise or Pidilite's franchise or HDFC Bank's franchise or Bajaj Finance franchise, are these going to sustain their monopoly strength for 5 years, for 15 years, for 25 years? Right? That is the sole purpose of a fund manager's existence. It is not to second guess the COVID wave, the 1Q earnings, the FY22 earnings, or the PE multiple. The sole job of a fund manager is to make a call on the longevity of the barriers to entry. And to answer that question, my colleagues and I, 15 of us who work in the investment team, need to spend 1 to 2 years to answer that question. We appreciate there are people far brighter than us who can answer this question in 15 days rather than the 15 months it often takes us. But we are happy with that. We don't have a problem. If they can do it in 15 days, good for them. They can make plenty of money in our country. But this is modern investing. A decade ago, this piece wasn't as essential, because a decade ago or 13 years ago when I came to India, it was such an underdeveloped market that people didn't even read the annual report properly, right? Today, people do read the annual report. I could argue we read a few more than them, but most people, most investors by and large, do read the annual report. And therefore, if you want to make money, you're only going to make money around 20 to 30 stocks in India, right? Your list would be different from my list, Raj, but the data is very clear. No more than 20 to 30 stocks in this country with 6,000 stocks will make you money. How long will those franchises sustain is the question that each of us is trying to answer. And our call on Nestle, just to be clear, our call on Nestle is that the monopoly can sustain comfortably for the next 20 years. So whatever Nestle's PE multiple is, even if we bought it at 3x that PE multiple, we would still comfortably generate a return on our investment well above the cost of our equity.
Okay, interesting. So you never make any decision on sizing the position based on, or valuation doesn't matter at all, as you said, and you never change your
So just
sizing
think,
of the position.
this is what I said. What should we size on? Should we size on
Mm.
valuation, or should we size on the length, the sustainability of the franchise? And we do the
Okay.
latter. There are people
Okay.
cleverer than us
Mm-hmm.
who size on valuation. I still haven't figured out how they do it. How do you size on valuation? I still haven't figured out. Do you say it's only 20% overvalued, so I'll buy less of it?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you say it's 20% undervalued, so I'll buy less of it. I never quite got around my head around. I haven't read anything sensible either. We've tried to figure it out, but our reckoning is a simpler way to go about it is size on the deeper the monopoly, the higher the barriers to entry, the greater the position size. So Asian Paints in most of our portfolios has a double-digit position sizing. Typically in our portfolios, the top 4 stocks will account for 40% of the portfolio. And these 4 stocks tend to be unchallenged monopolies. So in paints in India, it is not possible, hasn't been for the last 40 years, unlikely to be for the next 20 years to challenge Asian Paints. You can be whoever you want, the world's largest paint company, India's largest corporate. Feel free to come and challenge Asian Paints. It will not be practical. You'll not be entertained at the paint and hardware stores in our country. And if they don't entertain you at the paint and hardware stores in the country, you're not going to enter the living rooms of Indian households. So therefore, to understand that took us the best part of a couple of years, and Asian Paints therefore is a double-digit allocation. Go on, Raj.
Yeah. So while we spoke about some of the great companies, and do you want to bring in any name where your own thesis of the metrics you've been using got challenged by you guys itself, and you found that something which has changed, and you want to change your position? Any names you want to bring in, and what happened, or what did it bring in? If you're comfortable talking about it.
I've spoken about every company. I've spoken about our companies in our portfolio. So there are 3 reasons why we sell, right? None of them have anything to do with valuation. I'll quickly summarize the reasons why we sell, and then I'll try to give an example of a stock that we have sold. So the first reason we sell is when we see naughtiness, right? So as I've said at the outset, our corporate community is sort of drowned in a very corrupt ecosystem. And what we have seen, unfortunately, is even the cleanest of Indian corporates, even the cleanest of promoters gets tempted to steal money. And often we see when we do the forensics, even on our portfolio, we continue doing forensics. We see that the promoter has stolen 5-10 crores, right? And we obviously have a chat with him or her. And if we can't understand his point of view, we exit, right? Second reason we exit is capital allocation. By definition, these monopolies that we're investing in, the return on capital is 35, 40, 45, average 45%. Free cash flow, therefore, is 45% minus the cost of capital. Around 30% of capital employed is free cash flow. And because these franchises generate so much free cash flow, often they misallocate capital. And that's when we sit down and have a chat as to, please tell us, what are you thinking here? We are not being able to follow your thinking. And again, if we can't get on the same page as the board or the promoter on capital allocation, we check out. And the third reason is succession planning. A lot of these very successful franchises, the promoters are now north of 60 years of age. Often, they've ascended up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They're no longer focused on wealth. They're now focused on spirituality, charity, etc., etc. So they tend to abdicate control in favor of their sons and daughters. And sometimes we find that the sons and daughters are not up to the mark. At which point we again engage with the promoter and say, sir, your franchise, if you're not interested in running it, please let us know, because we don't want to be then involved in owning shares. Right. So just to sort of side, and these are obviously all 3 sets of conversations are difficult conversations, and we think it's part of our job to have those. We're not here to make friends with the promoter community. Our job is to manage money for our 6,000 clients. And if that means having difficult conversations, then so be it. Right. And then one has these conversations in a polite, hopefully cordial setting, and if the conversations work out and our franchise benefits, our investee companies benefit, so be it. If it doesn't, there's plenty of other investors that these companies can quote. Life moves on. So just to sort of give an example, ITC in many regards fits all of our criteria, right? It's as we know, it's essential. Cigarettes are essential. It's an unchallenged monopoly in cigarettes. There really is no competitor for all practical purposes. It's a giant cash machine, and we were ITC shareholders for a long time. Where we couldn't sort of see the logic of how ITC was functioning was in capital allocation, right? So they had the best part of 40,000 crores on their balance sheet a couple of years back, and we used to highlight that in our newsletters. So to give them a lot of credit, to give ITC a lot of credit, they reached out and they said, come to Kolkata, let's have a chat. And we went to Kolkata, Jan 2020. We went to Kolkata, had a long chat with them. We explained our concerns about the capital allocation to hotels, about the 65% payout ratio rather than 95%, and the 40,000 crores lying on the balance sheet. They said they told us that we've heard you. We'll now do whatever we think is appropriate. Again, to give more credit to them, I think it was April 2020, just the month after COVID hit the country hard. April 2020, ITC announced that they were going to increase the dividend payout ratio from 65 to 95%. And we said, big tick. Then I think May 2020, they further said that incremental capital allocation to hotels is going to stop. So we said even bigger tick. But in their AGM last year, June, I think it was June last year, they said that they were only going to do a 5,000 crores buyback, which meant 35,000 crores would stay on the balance sheet. And we couldn't quite see the logic of that. We had another brief chat just to make sure we hadn't misunderstood them. But once we realized that the surplus cash was going to sit on the balance sheet rather than being deployed to grow EPS, we felt it was best for us to check out. So July last year, we sold our ITC. So it remains a great monopoly. My reckoning is the stock will compound at around 15%. But our job is to compound for our clients at 20%. Most of our clients don't pay fixed fees. Most clients, we charge only performance fees. And therefore, for us to earn our performance fee properly, we need to compound at 20% at a minimum. And if we feel a franchise is not going to get us to 20% compounding net of fees, we tend to sell that stock.
So interestingly, ITC has got a maximum number of memes made on at least on Twitter. I see that this is the whole Twitter community is divided in ITC where so much fun is being made.
I wouldn't know. I'm not on Twitter.
I know that.
I've never been on it, so I wouldn't know anything about Twitter.
Interestingly, on the forensic part, you mentioned, and you said you have access to a team as well. Is it a big boys game, or even a retail guys can do some basic check?
I think you do have to be a chartered accountant, and I think the Indian CA qualification is extremely high quality, right? I've worked with British CAs before. I think the Indian CA qualification is amongst the best in the world. So we are in financial jargon, we are long on Indian CAs big time. Every year we make it a point of hiring 2 or 3 super bright CAs, chartered accountants into Marcellus. Can someone sitting at home do it? Yes, I think an intelligent amateur investor can do it. You obviously have to read up on accounts. So read Howard Financial Shenanigans by Howard Shillett, by far the best forensic accounting book I believe. If you're lucky enough to get a copy of Terry Smith's Accounting for Growth, it's out of print. But if you're one of those fortunate people who can get a copy of Terry Smith's Accounting for Growth, read that as well. We put on our website free of charge plenty of webinars, several of which are on forensic accounting. We have separate webinars on fraud accounting for lenders. There are presentations on our website. So I think intelligent, inquisitive amateur investors can also do a good job on forensic accounting. But it helps to have a good an Indian chartered accountancy, or any country if you're a British chartered accountant. But I think it's an essential aspect. If you can't read annual reports and you can't figure out how the promoter is stealing money, you're creating a big challenge for yourself if you're doing amateur investing on stocks in India.
Now, is there a case that a good business may not be a good investment? And if so, are there examples?
I don't really understand this piece, right?
You don't understand?
Talk about it. Sounds very erudite to say good business investment. I've also heard that I've heard a lot of people in India say to everything there is a price, and I've never quite understood how do you put a price on honesty, integrity, talent, barriers to entry, right? Because they're all derivatives of the same thing. Honesty, integrity, barriers to entry, talent, deep comparative advantages, world-class intellectual property. But to each their own. If somebody believes that everything has a price, they're welcome to that view. Who am I to challenge them?
No, so I'll bring an example of you mentioned airlines, right? So say Indigo, which has got about 55% market share.
Yeah.
Is it a good business?
I don't know. I mean, the way we've seen it is the basic assessment should be, does return on capital exceed cost of capital? I haven't seen any airline, any steel company, any telecom company, any real estate developer generate a return on capital above cost of capital. Now, I'm not a CA. I'll put my hand up and say I'm not a CA, I'm a CFA. But I learned in my level 1 of CFA that free cash flow is the basic reason for investing in a franchise. If you cannot deliver return on capital above cost of capital in any 10-year cycle, and by the way, I hope your podcast is widely listened. If
Yep.
anybody out there can show me one airline company, one telecom company, one steel manufacturer, or indeed metals more generally, let's include aluminum as well, and one real estate developer, which in any 10-year cycle has generated return on capital above cost of capital. I would love to know that, because it'll be a big learning for us as well. We haven't found that in India, which means that these sorts of franchises cannot create free cash flow. If they cannot create free cash flow, I fail to understand on what basis can I buy these shares.
So you mentioned about Divis, which is very competitive on a global scale on API, and so that one name you mentioned. Are there other businesses in listed space in India which has
There are
got
lots
some sort
actually.
of
So
a
this is one of the reasons why living in India is so much fun. So what were India's historical issues, right? India's historical issues were our infrastructure was poor, still is poor. It's less poor than it was 10 years ago, but our infrastructure still is obviously nothing compared to, forget China, even countries like Indonesia, Thailand are probably ahead of us on infra. Second issue was cost of capital was high. And third issue was cost of labor was high, right? Even the state I live in, Maharashtra, the minimum wage is thrice that of Bangladesh. Now, what's happened in the last 7, 8, 9 years is the rise of businesses driven by intangibles, by intellectual property, mitigates all the three issues I just mentioned, right? So Divi's is a great example of that. So is Fine Organics. So is Garware Technical Fibers. So increasingly what we are finding is Indian companies with 60, 70, 80% global market share, no competitors anywhere in vicinity, and we are the only Joes in town loading up big time on these stocks, right? And this is this feature of franchises like Garware, like GMM Pfaudler, like Divi's being global leaders, right? Garware Technical Fibers has 70% of the global market for salmon aquaculture nets. GMM Pfaudler has 55% of the global market for glass-lined ceramic reactors in which pharmaceutical products are made, right? Divi's, as I said, 75% of the global market for naproxen. In fact, more generally, out of the world's top 20 APIs, Divi's is the world leader in 9 out of top 20, right?
wow.
Now, all of this, and there's plenty more to come in this regard, right? As intellectual property, intangible assets becomes the main driver of wealth globally, this is playing right up India's alley, because it de-emphasizes our inadequacy in physical infrastructure. It de-emphasizes our labor market issues, and it mitigates to a significant extent our high cost of capital. And that's why, right, it's so important to look for companies in India where beyond the physical assets on the balance sheet, the main driver of competitive advantage is intangibles. And Bajaj is an example of that. Nestle is an example of that. Asian Paints is an example of that. HDFC Life Insurance is an example of that. Dr. Lal Path Labs is an example of that. Right? So if you look at Microsoft, right, massive company, I think on Microsoft's balance sheet, physical assets is only $3 billion. Right? Nobody really invests in Microsoft because of their campus in Seattle, I hope. They invest in Microsoft because of intellectual property. You invest in Divi's Lab or GMM Pfaudler or Fine Organics or Asian Paints or HDFC Life for much the same reason. It's just that if I tell you that you and I invest in Microsoft and Google because of intangible assets, people will say, "Ha, boss, bilkul." But if I tell you you invest in Asian Paints because of intangible assets, there'll be a blank look on the person's face. Kaun sa intangible asset? That's where doing the hard work and figuring out the intangible assets which drive Asian Paints' franchise becomes so central to making money in India.
Interesting. So, the last decade, and I think I heard you as well that you mentioned Nifty earnings have been probably zero in the last 10 years. And the returns also probably very low in terms of the dollar for sure. How does the next decade, and you brought in some of the interesting point, how does the next decade look
what
like?
you said is true, but it has no relevance for me. I'm not investing in the Nifty. I have zero interest in the Nifty for the reasons we discussed right at the outset.
Yeah.
Capital allocation, corruption. Right? India's nominal GDP growth over the last 10 years has been around 10%. Right? I mean, whatever skepticism your listeners might have on India's GDP accounting, at least I hope they'll believe that the
Yep.
country's nominal GDP growth has been 10%. Almost all of that upside has gone to 20 champion monopolists. The Nifty has not benefited because, as you rightly said, Nifty EPS growth across 3, 5, and 10 years is zero. The Indian monopolist CPS growth across 1, 3, 5, and 10 years is 20%. Right? So the Nifty has nothing to do. Investing in the Nifty, right? I hope your listeners understand this carefully. Investing in the Nifty has nothing to do with making money in India. And if anybody listening to this is crazy enough to invest in a tracker fund and gain exposure to India like that, God save you, because the bulk of your money is going towards promoters who care zero about capital allocation and have no comparative advantages.
So when you look at the next 10 years, you still look at, so
Same
basically
paradigm.
you're more bottoms up.
The strong will get stronger. As we
Okay.
discussed at the beginning of our conversation, these monopolists are already occupying 70, 80% market shares. By the time the decade is out, they will account for 90, 100% market shares in many industries. And as you rightly mentioned or alluded to 5 minutes back, in several cases, they're taking their monopolies global. They're taking the monopolies global on the strength of their intellectual property, not on the strength of their physical assets. Physical assets, I don't think we can compete with countries like China, but on intellectual property, in especially sectors like pharma, spec chem, specialty chemicals, light industrial manufacturing, we can hack it in intellectual property. Basically, anything to do with process chemistry and industrial engineering, we are capable. And that's where, after dominating India, these franchises are increasingly growing global. Unfortunately, these franchises form no more than 30% of the Nifty, or whichever global index you're using, MSCI India or whatever. And therefore, if you are one of those people who seeks exposure to India via a tracker fund, it'll be tough for you to benefit from the monopoly paradigm in our country.
So let's bring in the behavioral aspect, right? I mean, because, as they say, investing is a lot more about behavioral as well. And I think I read from one of your books as well that we regret losses two and a half times more than the gains, right? And patience is a big virtue, and said so because it's missing in many people. So what's your thought on, since you read and write a lot, you have any thoughts on behavioral side?
I haven't reached that level of evolution where I can self-analyze myself behaviorally. We have a counselor, a psychologist who helps us discuss behavioral issues. But I'm not so self-evolved that I can critique my own behavioral biases. And clearly, as you would have made out over the last hour, I have several biases about how to invest. What we have tried to do is create a team where everybody shouts loudly and punches quite hard, so that whatever biases the 15 of us have, in the totality, the biases at least get muted, if not completely subsumed, right? Not completely submerged. So if you create a Lala franchise, if I create a Lala franchise, anybody creates a Promoter Ji Ka, Lala Ji Ka franchise, obviously there's a greater risk that the behavioral biases become very prominent, because we are all human, we are all frail, we're all fallible. But by creating a franchise where a broad group of people with differing views, different preferences, different behaviors, you create less risk of behavioral bias driving investing.
Interesting. So since our show is called actually Breaking Investment Stereotypes, any stereotype which comes to your mind, which in your journey of investing you've broken, or you want to share with our listeners?
No, I get told by a lot of people that for a Bengali you speak very good Hindi. So I don't quite know how to respond to that.
Okay.
Feel like saying
I have quite a few friends actually Bengali and who speak very good Hindi. So yeah.
So it is what it is. I think a lot of people in our country still think in terms of in terms of Madrasi, Punjabi, Bengali. So they're welcome to think like that. But I think the more such categories we create in our mind, the more meaningless barriers we impose in our mind. And similarly, there are other people who say, well, I thought FIIs are better investors than domestic investors, or there are other people who think vice versa. So the less one tries to create archetypes, stereotypes in one's mind, the easier it is as Daniel Kahneman so beautifully points out in that book, right? Thinking Fast and Slow. The reason we create stereotypes, racial stereotypes, religious stereotypes in India, caste-based, language-based stereotypes, is because it's a heuristic which helps us deal with day-to-day life. It might have worked 50 years ago, but
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, it doesn't work anymore, right? The more stereotypes one gets into, I think the less useful one's brain becomes.
So we're coming to the last part of our podcast, and I'll bring in some of your personal elements here. So how would you describe yourself? If you take out your persona of a hotshot fund manager.
No, I think the way I'll describe myself is the way my wife describes me, a sort of geek who reads nonstop and has an opinion on every planet, every subject under the sun.
Okay. So since you brought about the reading, do you want to give some book recommendations for the audience? What are you reading nowadays, and which one do you like? Also, more importantly, how do you journal your thoughts? Because that's what I've been finding a lot of problem with me. I read,
Right.
can't read too long.
Every Sunday we publish, anybody who's listening, you can sign up. It's easy, go to marcellus.in. Every Sunday we publish the 6 best reads of the week from across the whole team. Around 25,000 people subscribe to it. It's free. We don't charge money for this. So if you go to our website and just go to one of the newsletters or blogs, and you'll see a pop-up. Put your email address there, and you'll get our 3 longs and 3 shorts, 7 a.m. Indian time on Sunday. So every week the team collates whoever's read the best pieces. We collate in one place and we send it out to the whole world. That's our way of journaling, I guess, Rajkumar. And especially through this lockdown, we've tried to read a book a week. It's been a lot of fun doing that. We try to publish a book every alternate year, and that keeps us sort of writing plenty, because if you have to publish a book every alternate year, you have to do some degree of writing every week. For each of our 3 funds that you mentioned, Little Champs, Consistent Compounders, and Kings of Capital, there's a newsletter every month. So that means there are 3 newsletters for 3 products every month. So there's a fair bit of writing which happens. We found writing to be very useful. It helps you build your neural networks. It helps you journal, catalog your thoughts. It helps you spot flaws in your thinking. The more you write, the more gaps in your thinking you're able to spot. And in terms of books to read, obviously, if anybody's interested in whatever we've written, Gurus of Chaos was my first book, 2014, about the 6 fund managers who taught me the most in India. It was my little Guru Dakshina too. People like Naren, people like Sashi Reddy, people like Manjunath Ji, people like K.N. Sivasubramaniam. 2016 was Unusual Billionaires, about the 6 or 7 franchises which shaped our thinking on monopolies, right? I think it's now, I think in its 3rd edition. If the Audible version has been made available free of charge to you, courtesy, I guess, the kindness of Mr. Jeff Bezos. 2018 was Coffee Can Investing. That's how we created a wealth management construct for the average person who might not be able to afford our services. So Coffee Can Investing is how do you build your own portfolio, your own wealth over your working life without hiring expensive fund managers and wealth managers. That's, I think, gone on to become the largest selling personal finance book written by a brown person, right? Because a lot of Indians have this fascination. If it's published in America, they immediately have to read it. But if it's published in India, and I never quite understood that. But anyway, to each their own. We're hoping to publish our next book this summer, COVID permitting, because even our publisher has been hit hard by COVID. So COVID permitting, hopefully our next book will come out this summer. More generally, the books that I've learned a lot from was Roger Lowenstein, his book on Buffett, The Making of an American Capitalist. I felt that's the best biography I think that's been written on Buffett. Roger Lowenstein, The Making of Buffett, The Making of an American Capitalist. I think Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, enormously useful. And if you focus on India, right, books on India where you can learn a lot about the country, and you can develop a very differentiated view on the country. 3 books that I think stand out. First is V.S. Naipaul, India, A Million Mutinies Now, published in 1990. I read it when it was published in 1990. I read it once every 10 years, and every time I read it, it still feels like it was written yesterday morning, right? Then Ramachandra Guha, India After Gandhi. I think an essential book. I think every Indian should read that book as to where our country was in that first 5 years, 10 years, 20 years after independence, and how far we have come. Anybody who sits out there outside India and is trying to hedge the rupee, you certainly should read Ramachandra Guha, India After Gandhi. You'll probably benefit more from reading a broker's report on the dollar rupee forecast. And I think the third book, uh, 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 it's formally written by Sunil Khilnani ji. It's called Incarnations, India in 50 Lives. Although it's formally written by Sunil Khilnani ji, who's a professor of Indian history in London. I reckon it's actually written by Manu Pillai, who I think is the best young writer in India today. He's written several superb books, but I think Incarnations, India in 50 Lives is just simply sublime. If you don't like reading, you can go to the BBC website and there's a podcast. There are, I think, 10 podcasts on the BBC website on the 50 Lives, right? Beautiful podcasts. I think ideal for a Sunday evening with a glass of something nice to drink rather than listening to some financial news podcast, rather than listening to me about investing in India.
Thanks. This is a question we ask every every guest. What will be your advice to your own 20-year-old self?
I think advice will be formal education counts for zero formal education. Don't worry about your credentialing and this qualification and that education and this degree.
It gives you entry ticket.
Nothing, yeah. It gives you nothing. It just gives you false sense of entitlement, and it's deeply damaging. This whole notion that go to this university, that university. It's the kind of most useless form of credentialing that I think we follow, and I did it. I have to confess, and I'm the poorer for it, having spent most of my youth in this mistaken notion that the prestige of the university you go to somehow has some bearing on your life and is a reflection of you. It isn't. And I think it'll be even clearer 10 years hence. I think for my children's generation, the notion that formal education somehow contributes to making you the person that you become, I think will be increasingly challenged. In our lifetime itself, we will discover that what we learned in university actually counts for very little. And those developing those habits around learning, reading, learning non-stop will become far more important. I wish I had understood that when I was 21 rather than when I was 41.
Thanks. So I think this is it's a great conversation we have had, Saurabh, and really thankful to you. I really enjoyed it, and I'm very sure our listeners are going to enjoy it as well. So really nice talking to you, and we of course owe to each other another discussion over a cup of or a glass of something interesting. On for sure on the real estate.
Apple juice will also suffice, Rajkumar.
Thank you, Saurabh.
My pleasure, sir.